name is Etkin. I'm the CEO and founder of Sleuth. In a past life, I did a lot of time at Atlassian. So I was an OG developer on Jira. I ran the BitBucket team for about 5 years, and then ran the status page team for about 4 years over at Atlassian as well. And so I'm going to try and make eye contact with the camera in this new pandemic reality of presentations. And if I forget to do so, it's not because I don't love all of you out there. It's because I'm adapting to this crazy new world. And my cat might jump into our conversation at any given time. You never know. So
she's very welcome.
Yeah, no, she's cute. Don't worry. It'll be good. So today I'm going to talk to you about impact in production. And I'm going to start with a bit of a bold claim. And what I would like to say is that without understanding your change's impact, you don't know if you are helping or hurting. So I think it helps to define what I mean by impact, because I think these things could mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people. So often impact, the way that I refer to it, is referred to as an SLI, or a service level indicator. These values will frequently be stored in observability platforms like New Relic or Datadog or SignalFx. Some examples of impact: these are usually things that are very specific to your application or the application that you're building, and they often are really about the effect on the utility that you provide via your application. So, for example, say in status page, the percentage of emails arriving in a user's inbox in under 5 minutes from an incident was really important to us, and that was something that we measured and made sure that we understood the impact of. Something like Amazon, the search relevance of the catalog results that are coming back plays a huge impact into the amount of money that they can generate. Say for LaunchDarkly, response time for a feature flag request, since that's happening in the main line of an application of their customers, that's obviously something that they care a lot about. And then more generally, maybe availability and uptime of a service could be something that you're measuring impact on. And it really pays to make the distinction that impact isn't monitoring and alerting, but they often overlap. So monitoring and alerting are a lot about the service is unavailable or you have breached a threshold that is unacceptable. Impact is really about how is your service doing and how is the utility that you're providing functioning, and have you made that better or have you made that worse, or maybe even neutral. So hopefully all of you out there are working on a modern team. Maybe you're working on a DevOps team, and that means that your team is moving fast. You're doing all sorts of cool things. You guys are probably deploying anywhere between 1 to 50 times a day. You have a neat CD pipeline set up. You're tracking errors with Rollbar and Sentry or Honey Badger. You have APM with Datadog or New Relic. You're tracking metrics with SignalFx. You're deploying with feature flags, so you're using LaunchDarkly, of course. And you're storing logs and Docker containers somewhere on the internet. You're doing pull requests and reviews with GitHub, and you're issue tracking with Jira. And moving fast is absolutely great. But if your team is changing 50 things 50 times a day, how do you know what is impacting what? And how can you tie the impact of individual changes to impact on your application? Now, I would argue that the longer it takes to discover the cause of negative impact, the more it will cost to fix, if it gets fixed at all, honestly. And the reason for this is that the individual responsible for a change loses context. So if you ship something that, say, increases your error rate by 1%, if you're told about that within 5 or 10 minutes, you're going to go ahead and you're going to make that fix. If it shows up 2 weeks later, that issue is going to go into your backlog. Now it's going to fight with other issues for priority. And the person who's going to maybe work on that doesn't necessarily have the context. They need to regain all of that to understand why that change was negative instead of positive. And then another issue is that if you're moving as fast as you are on these modern teams, the cause of negative impact is buried in 1,000 changes within the span of just a couple of weeks. It's really hard to identify with all that change what's going on. And then furthermore, what happens very frequently is that the diminished state becomes your new normal. And you don't necessarily, without measuring, understand what your desired state is. And you really run the risk of getting to this new negative state. The bold statement, I was talking about impact and what impact is, and really at the end of the day, it's the effect on the utility that you provide, with some examples that you may remember from my recent talk. I was talking about just how fast we're moving in terms of DevOps teams, and the amount of changes that are going on, and tying those changes back to individual impact, and how that can be quite difficult in a fast-moving environment. And then this one I was just blabbing on about, and talking about how really at the end of the day, it's the high time to discovery of negative impact that costs. And those costs come out in a million different things. And I'll go into that a little bit more now. And that's where we were at. I was going to shift into basically some battle stories. I don't know about you guys, but I like stories. They add context to things. And so I'll just talk a little bit about some experiences from my past, where impact really played into a situation, and a lack of monitoring and a high time to discovery ended up costing teams real things. So the first one I'll talk about is just a recent occurrence on Sleuth. I was actually working on a feature, funny enough, around impact. So it's a very meta story, because we're building a tool that's going out and trying to measure impact on the things that you're doing on deploys. And so in order to do that, what we need to do is we need to get a bunch of your SLI data, and we need to figure out what is the range of normal for you. And then we use an anomaly detection, an outlier detection tool. There's a great tool in Python, by the way, called PyOD. It's the Python outlier detection tool, and it's got all these like modern algorithms just built into the thing. It's great. Long story short, it's actually a bit of a memory hog, though. So I was using this tool to learn about the training data for all of these metrics that we were collecting. I did a deploy at about 3:30 in the afternoon. Working in a modern way, we had it behind a feature flag. No code was actually executing through any of that, so it seemed like a fairly safe deploy. But we didn't have any impact detection set up at the time, because obviously we were trying to build it. I went to sleep thinking, hey, I'd done a great thing and shipped this feature. And then while I was sleeping, one of our developers in Europe got an alert, and memory had grown across of our entire fleet. And you could just see this like graph of things like going up, 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 up. And so she spent a bunch of time digging into this thing and trying to figure out what was going on. By the time I woke up and jumped online, there was a second developer who had been looking into the problem. They probably wasted about 3 hours looking into this thing. When we were eventually able to track it down to that it happened at the moment of deploy, it was really easy for myself with the context to turn around and make a change. So basically we moved the import from global to local, and that meant that we were only going to like pay that memory cost when we actually needed to use the thing. But I think the interesting part about this story is that quick detection of the impact meant that the person who had context, myself, could quickly create a fix. But the real scary part here is that we got lucky. We were relying on alerting thresholds to actually find this bug. And if we hadn't breached that, this probably would have been our new norm, and we would have just moved on thinking, hey, this is how much memory our application takes, which would have had a cost to us. And so you can see where if we had had impact around memory for this, we would have caught it straight away. The next story I want to tell is from my days on BitBucket. So BitBucket gets a ton of SSH traffic, right? So it's a source code hosting site for those that don't know. And what that means is that clients are connecting and then doing a certain something and disconnecting over SSH, thousands of times a minute. And so early on in BitBucket, we had a very naive implementation. Everything was in Python as well. And so we would spin up a Python environment. We had hacked OpenSSH to execute a Python script. And I think in the early days, we loaded all of Django every time we did that. And that was just a crushing blow to our CPU. And so you can imagine like loading an entire Python environment every time somebody's just doing a tiny little Git operation with SSH. Took a real toll on our overall fleet. And we were based on bare metal hardware, which meant that we had to manage like our resources pretty thoroughly too. So we had fixed it and basically gotten back 50% of our CPU by removing the ability to, or the need to bring in Django. And then at some point, some developer just innocuously added an import that added another thing that it brought in that eventually brought in the entire Django stack. And so that change didn't breach any alerting thresholds. We weren't monitoring the impact of the CPU usage. And it probably took us about 6 months to actually find that change. The impact to customers was pretty high because it meant that every time they were trying to do an operation, it took longer. And it was very high to us. We actually ended up spending, I think it was about $150,000 in server costs that we eventually needed, but we didn't need at the time. And so you could imagine a world where we had actually discovered that impact in the moment we had made that change, and we would have avoided all of those issues. The last example I want to run you through is one that I've seen a number of times on teams that I've run, and I'm guessing you have seen too, which is on status page, we were sending, well, a lot of what status page does is sending email notifications. So when a customer creates an incident, we send a bunch of notifications to all of their users to let them know that things are down. And we tried to do that in a very redundant way. We had 2 email providers. We were using SendGrid and Mailgun. And SendGrid was not set up in a way that it would do DKIM verification. And that meant that some of the emails we were sending were not as truthful or valid as they could be. So we decided to spin up a new project where we would improve DKIM for all of our SendGrid users. And the trick is we did exactly the opposite, right? So the whole point of this project and the whole point of the work that we did was to make things better. And we spent weeks of time. We went out to users and we asked them to put in new keys into their DNS. We did all sorts of things to make DKIM processing better. But what we didn't do is we didn't measure the impact of that. So we had stats around the amount of mail that hit inboxes, but we didn't have stats that talked about how many emails were going to spam. And so over a 6 to 8 month period, issues would come into support where it looked like some emails were disappearing, and we would track them down. We must have used up probably 10 different developers worth of time investigating these issues. And eventually, probably 8 months down the road, one of the developers noticed that, like, hey, this is incorrectly configured. And like maybe even a third of the emails that we're sending via this provider are going straight to spam for customers. So this is an example where we weren't measuring the impact of the thing that we were trying to fix. And in trying to make things better, we had turned around and made things actually worse. And that was a huge impact to customers because we had asked them to do DNS changes that we needed them to do again. And then the time to resolve this issue was huge. It was probably about 12 weeks of dev time. And had we put impact measurements in place in the beginning, we would have known that the thing we were trying to do didn't actually have the positive effect that we were looking for. So all of these stories have a very similar thread, which is that the longer it takes to discover impact, the longer it takes to fix, and the larger the overall cost is. So how do we get better? How do we get to a place where we can like bring impact measurements really close and home to the individual? And that's what I want to talk you through now is how do we improve, right? So what are 3 things that you out there can do right now today? Here's 3 actions that I think if you were to take right now, you would just be worlds better than you are probably at the moment. So, and these are fairly simple things, and actually maybe a lot of you are already doing them. But the first thing that you can do is just define 1 or 2 SLIs with reliable measures. These should be real-time measures and reliable. That's very important. So what you need to do is you need to take a good hard look at your application and ask yourself, what is the primary source of utility that the application is offering? And what is a statistic that we can capture in real time reliably that would give us some indication of whether we are doing what we're supposed to be doing or not? And once you have that SLI defined, you really need to communicate that with your entire team because this sort of thing doesn't work if your whole team isn't bought in and doesn't feel a sense of ownership, right? So what that means is you have some mechanism for communicating with your team. Maybe pre-pandemic, you have like a dashboard up with like key statistics. You need to put that up there. Or maybe you have like a Slack channel where you publish interesting information. Like there's some way that you have of sharing information with your team. You want to get that SLI into that channel so that everybody's constantly reminded about the thing. And then the last thing I would suggest that you do is make impact part of your definition of done, such that your SLIs remain positive or at the very worst neutral. And putting an SLI or impact into your definition of done means that you're pushing every developer to take responsibility for the changes that they're making to your SLIs, right? Because at the end of the day, they're your sources of change, and they're the ones that need to understand the impact of the things that they're doing. So you might be looking at this and thinking, hey, I've got like a modern CD platform. I don't need to worry about any of this because like we're already like rolling so far forward that everything's great for us anyway. And so there's definitely some amazing tools out there nowadays, and they are definitely amazing at addressing the symptom of this. I'm going to argue that they're not so great at addressing the cause, but some things that larger companies are doing, or even smaller teams, maintaining a dedicated SRE team that just monitors everything. Like their job is to understand impact and to get in there if things aren't going right. And then there's modern CD containers like Circle CI or Harness.io, where you're able to set up canary deploys, you're doing continuous verification, you have automated rollbacks. Now, often these systems are set up closer to alerting thresholds, so they're not great at solving the frog in boiling water problem, like where the frog's in the hot water and it becomes boiling and then it's in some real trouble. The other thing that they don't do is they don't shorten the time to discovery of incremental negative impact. So again, if you're not breaching like some sort of crazy limit and you're just making things worse a little bit every day, this sort of system isn't going to catch that. And also, they're just really resource intensive to set up and maintain. And the downside from my perspective is that it does move some responsibility away from individuals. And at the end of the day, we want to be empowering. DevOps is about empowering everybody on the team to understand the changes they're making. And that needs to be a cultural thing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my vision of the future and how tools out there might be able to support us in a world where we're caring a lot about impact. I am going to talk a little bit about Sleuth, but I think a lot of these things you could do without Sleuth. It's just, why would you want to? So the key for all of this is tying deploys to impact. So you're making changes. Changes can come from any number of directions in our modern environments. It can come from external sources. It can come from feature flags. It can come from code. It can come from infrastructure. And then we want to define these SLIs in some sort of system of record. And then we want to be able to detect anomalies in those things. So again, it's fine to have a set of normal, right? You just want to understand, have I breached normal? Have I gotten way worse outside of normal? Or have I made things better? You know, like do we have less errors as part of this change? So you really understand, how are the things that I'm adding to the system affecting the system? Another key to getting better at this is alerting authors about impact within minutes. So what that can look like is if you have some monitoring set up, like for impact, maybe you alert somebody via Slack. I mean, that's what we're doing in Sleuth, is that when you've made a change and your change has gone out, we'll turn around and direct message the individual in Slack to say, hey, your change went out, and according to your SLI, it's healthy. So go ahead and keep having your coffee. The other thing you need is one place to simply understand all the impact of the changes you've made. As I had mentioned earlier with DevOps teams, we have an amazing array of tools at our disposal, but it's unreasonable to think that every individual knows every nook and cranny where we store everything on the internet today. There needs to be a very simple one place to understand, what am I doing and how has that affected things in terms of deployments. And I would argue that the future will not come true if we don't automate. You know, if you have manual steps involved in any sorts of things, it's really hard to understand what you're doing. Are we getting better or worse or the same over time? So you need to have automation in place to support this sort of way of working. So to just sum it up real quick, impact in production, you need to understand your impact in production. You need to know what's important to your service and measure it in real time. You need to empower developers to make positive impact. And we really need to reduce the discovery time down to minutes. And the way that we do that is modern tools for the modern teams that we are working on. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about with impact in production. And I thank you for your time.